Imagine living in a world where every smile hides a secret, where every handshake could be a betrayal, and where revenge isn't just personal, it becomes a weapon capable of changing history. Germany has witnessed some of the darkest revenge stories the world has ever known. Some were born from war. Others emerged from betrayal, humiliation, and unbearable loss. These weren't simple acts of anger. They were carefully planned, cold, relentless, and sometimes so devastating that entire nations paid the price. Tonight, we begin with one of the most chilling stories ever told. Not a legend, not a myth, but a revenge that unfolded in the shadows of one of Europe's most turbulent eras. The year was 1919. Germany was broken. The First World War had ended, leaving cities damaged, families grieving, and millions struggling to survive. The once powerful German Empire had collapsed. Soldiers returned home expecting gratitude, only to find unemployment, hunger, and political chaos waiting for them. For many Germans, the greatest wound wasn't the battlefield. It was humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles demanded enormous reparations, reduced Germany's military, and forced the nation to accept responsibility for the war. To countless citizens, it felt less like peace and more like punishment. That humiliation planted a dangerous seed. Across Germany, whispers began spreading through cafes, factories, and crowded streets. One day, we will make them pay. Those words echoed through a nation desperate to reclaim its pride. But revenge rarely begins with armies. It begins with people. One such man was a decorated former soldier who believed Germany had been betrayed from within. He watched political unrest grow while extremist groups fought in the streets. Every clash added fuel to his anger. He wasn't alone. Thousands of veterans felt abandoned. Families blamed politicians. Workers blamed businessmen. Politicians blamed one another. The country was becoming a powder keg. Meanwhile, secret organizations formed behind closed doors. Their meetings were hidden. Their members spoke in whispers. They believed revenge wasn't simply justified. They believed it was necessary. Across Munich, Berlin, and other German cities, underground groups recruited angry young men. They promised strength, unity, and justice, but their vision of justice often meant revenge against anyone they believed responsible for Germany's suffering. Small acts of violence soon became organized campaigns. Political opponents disappeared. Journalists received threats. Public rallies ended in bloodshed. Every act of revenge inspired another. Hatred became a cycle. The streets grew more dangerous with each passing month. Ordinary citizens learned never to ask too many questions. Never speak too loudly. Never trust the wrong person. Because in this new Germany, revenge had become contagious. And once revenge spreads through a nation, stopping it becomes nearly impossible. The next chapter would see these hidden movements grow into powerful organizations capable of reshaping Germany and eventually the entire world. Their revenge would no longer target individuals. It would target entire populations. And history would never be the same. By the early 1920s, Germany was no longer simply recovering from war. It was collapsing from within. Every morning, newspapers carried new headlines about political violence, economic disaster, and growing fear. Inflation had become so extreme that families carried baskets full of money just to buy a loaf of bread. Workers were paid in stacks of banknotes that lost value before they reached home. Parents watched their savings disappear overnight. Children went hungry. Businesses closed one after another. For millions of Germans, the future seemed hopeless. And whenever people lose hope, someone always arrives with a promise. Across crowded beer halls and public squares, passionate speakers began gathering audiences. They didn't promise peace. They promised revenge. They blamed Germany's suffering on enemies, both foreign and domestic. Every speech repeated the same message: someone must pay. Crowds that had once come merely to listen soon began cheering. Anger transformed into belief. Belief transformed into loyalty. And loyalty became dangerous. As political movements grew stronger, uniforms appeared in the streets. Organized groups marched in perfect formation, carrying banners and flags while chanting slogans that promised Germany would rise again. To supporters, these marches represented pride. To opponents, they were warnings. Violence became increasingly common. Political meetings were interrupted. Opposing groups fought in the streets. Windows shattered. Buildings burned. People disappeared after dark. Many ordinary citizens citizens no longer felt safe expressing their opinions. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Friends questioned friends. Even families became divided by politics. Fear slowly entered every home. Then came a failed attempt to seize power. Armed supporters marched through Munich believing they could overthrow the government. Instead, the rebellion collapsed. Several people were killed. Its leaders were arrested. Many believed the movement had ended forever. But prison gave its leaders something even more powerful than freedom. It gave them time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to transform failure into strategy. When they emerged, they no longer relied only on violence. They understood something far more effective. Control people's emotions. And eventually, you can control a nation. They used speeches, newspapers, posters, and public gatherings to spread a simple story. Germany had been humiliated, betrayed, and robbed of its future. And only complete national unity could restore its honor. For many desperate citizens, the message was irresistible. As economic hardship continued, support grew. Election after election, their influence expanded. Critics warned that hatred was replacing democracy, but their voices were becoming harder to hear, because fear often speaks louder than reason. By the end of the decade, the world entered another catastrophe. The Great Depression. Factories shut down. Banks failed. Millions lost their jobs. The crisis didn't just destroy economies. It destroyed confidence. People wanted certainty. They wanted strength. They wanted someone who claimed to have all the answers. And when that promise arrived, millions embraced it. What had begun as scattered calls for revenge after World War I was becoming something much larger. A movement. A government. Soon, an empire built on anger. Its leaders insisted that Germany would never again accept humiliation. Instead, they promised that every insult would be answered, every defeat reversed, every enemy punished. The world was about to witness what happens when revenge becomes national policy. And once that machine began moving, no one, not even many of its own supporters, could stop it. Power rarely arrives with a single dramatic moment. It grows quietly, one law at a time, one speech at a time, one fearful decision after another. By the early 1930s, Germany had changed. The government no longer asked people to trust it. It expected obedience. Public rallies became massive spectacles. Thousands gathered beneath enormous banners, while military bands echoed through city streets. Searchlights pierced the night sky, creating scenes that looked almost unreal. To many supporters, these displays symbolized hope and national pride. To others, they were reminders that disagreement was becoming dangerous. New laws followed. Political rivals were arrested. Independent newspapers disappeared. Criticism grew quieter with every passing month. People learned that even a careless conversation could attract unwanted attention. Children were taught to report suspicious remarks. Teachers watched their students. Students watched their teachers. Coworkers watched one another. Fear had become part of everyday life. The government insisted that Germany had been surrounded by enemies for years, nations that wanted to keep it weak, people who had supposedly betrayed it from within, and political forces that threatened its future. This narrative transformed revenge into something larger than personal anger. It became a national mission. Many citizens accepted it. Others remained silent because silence felt safer than resistance. Factories that had once struggled now worked day and night, but they were no longer producing only civilian goods. Steel became tanks. Rubber became tires for military vehicles. Workshops produced rifles, artillery, and aircraft. The nation was preparing for something far greater than recovery. Across Europe, neighboring countries watched with growing concern. Some hoped diplomacy would prevent another conflict. Others feared they were witnessing the birth of a new catastrophe. Meanwhile, inside Germany, a powerful security network expanded rapidly. Its purpose was clear: find anyone considered a threat. Whether the accusation was true or false often mattered little. People vanished into prisons. Families searched for answers that never came. Letters stopped arriving. Doors remained closed. Questions remained unanswered. The atmosphere of uncertainty spread everywhere. Ordinary life continued on the surface. Children attended school. Shops opened every morning. Trains ran on schedule. Concerts filled theaters. But beneath that appearance of normality, fear lingered. Many people avoided discussing politics, even in their own homes. Walls, they believed, believed, might have ears. The idea of revenge had evolved again. It was no longer directed only toward foreign powers. It was also aimed at anyone labeled an obstacle to the government's vision. Entire communities became targets. Long-standing neighbors suddenly found themselves isolated. Businesses were boycotted. Careers ended overnight. Rights that had existed for generations disappeared one by one. Each new measure was presented as necessary for Germany's future. Each restriction was defended as justice. But history would later remember it differently, because when revenge is disguised as justice, the consequences can become impossible to control. As military strength continued to grow, Germany's leaders became increasingly confident. Treaties that had once limited the country's armed forces were openly ignored. New divisions of soldiers marched through cities. Advanced aircraft filled the skies. Warships expanded the navy. The message to the world was unmistakable. Germany would no longer accept the limits imposed after the First World War. The promise of revenge had become a strategy, and that strategy was now backed by one of the fastest-growing military machines in Europe. Many foreign leaders hoped compromise could preserve peace. They believed negotiation would calm the crisis. History would prove how tragically mistaken that hope was, because the next step would not be another speech. It would not be another election. It would be the opening move of a conflict that would engulf continents, reshape the world, and cost tens of millions of lives. The revenge born from humiliation after World War I was about to ignite an even greater tragedy. The victories had come quickly, too quickly. By the summer of 1941, German forces controlled vast stretches of Europe. From the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union, millions lived under German occupation. Many believed that no army on earth could stop them. Then came the decision that would change everything. German leaders launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history. More than 3 million soldiers crossed the border. Thousands of tanks rolled east. Aircraft filled the skies. The campaign was expected to end within months. Instead, it became a nightmare. At first, the advance seemed unstoppable. Entire regions fell rapidly, and thousands of prisoners were captured. But as the German army moved deeper into Soviet territory, the land itself became an enemy. Roads turned into endless mud after heavy rains. Supply trucks became stuck for days. Fuel ran dangerously low. Food became scarce. Then winter arrived. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Engines refused to start. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, newspapers, and anything they could find just to survive the night. Many had never experienced such extreme cold. The campaign that was supposed to deliver final victory became a desperate fight for survival. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the turning point. Street by street, building by building, both sides fought with relentless determination. For months, the city became one of the bloodiest battlefields in history. When the fighting finally ended, an entire German army had surrendered. The shock was enormous. For the first time, the image of an unstoppable Germany had been shattered. Across Europe, resistance movements grew stronger. Occupied nations found new hope. The Allies advanced from the west. The Soviet army pushed from the east. Germany was now fighting on multiple fronts, losing experienced soldiers faster than they could be replaced. Cities that had once celebrated military parades now echoed with air raid sirens. Bombs fell night after night. Historic buildings collapsed. Factories burned. Families sought shelter in underground bunkers, uncertain whether they would ever see daylight again. The same nation that had promised revenge now faced destruction on a scale few had imagined. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered Berlin. The capital had become a city of ruins. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Smoke covered the skyline. The sound of artillery never seemed to stop. Inside an underground bunker, Germany's leader realized that defeat was inevitable. Within days, his rule came to an end. Soon afterward, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But the cost was beyond comprehension. More than 60 million people lost their lives during the Second World War. Countless cities were destroyed. Millions were displaced from their homes.